IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I am Pranay and I have with me Sankalp and Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan. Yesterday we were speaking how we can count Indian academic realist theorists on fingertips, and we are very lucky that we actually have an Indian realist theorist here. So welcome Professor Rajesh. I wanted to begin with asking you, why do you think there are so few realists in India itself?
Thank you, Pranay. Thank you for inviting me to this podcast. I'm very happy to be here. To get to your question about why India has so few realists, it's a matter of surprise because obviously India also has traces of realism in its political tradition. Kautilya and Arthashastra are great. It's a great example of that. But nevertheless, you're right that there are very few Indian realists. I can't count of very many Indian realists actually, but I think the reason has to do with the identification of realism with U.S. foreign policy and with imperialism and the Nehruvian tradition, because Nehru was a fierce critic of realist thought, especially balance of power, and he saw balance of power logic first of all as outdated, and he repeatedly talked about how this was 19th century thinking, but also thinking that led to the First World War and the Second World War, and therefore was not something that was suitable for India. So his criticism of balance of power and realist thinking, as well as the general association of realism with U.S. foreign policy and imperialism, I think led to a kind of antipathy towards realism, even though I would argue, and others have argued, that there were times and aspects of Indian foreign policy which could be considered realist. But nevertheless, at the intellectual level, there has been a severe antipathy towards realism. And so you find very few realists in Indian thinking about foreign policy. I mean, we should also distinguish between academic realism and realpolitik thinking, which is associated with realism, but is not the same thing as realism. And so we have had...
What's the difference?
The difference is that realpolitik is about doing whatever is expedient in terms of current policy, current foreign policy, or current strategic policy. Realism as a theory is more about some basic principles, and those principles remain true irrespective of the specifics of a situation, whereas realpolitik would change depending on the circumstances. And so there is a distinction in that. They are very closely related in terms of their focus on power, in terms of their focus on national interests and things like that, but there are also distinctions. For example, I'll give you a couple of examples. K. Subramaniam is a classic realpolitik, a thinker in the Indian context, but he was also a proponent of nuclear disarmament. He was also made strong arguments about the inadequacy of the NPT, things like that, which were all aspects of Indian policy, but not necessarily aspects of, or not necessarily, doesn't necessarily flow from realism as a theory. So there are elements, therefore, where realpolitik and realism, in a sense, do not go together.
Right.
It's not all the time, but there are cases like that. And the other aspect of it is that because they were not specifically academic realists in terms of the theory of realism, they didn't bother too much with the basic principles. They were sort of focusing more on a specific issue, specific issues of foreign policy. In that sense, there was no theory development or the development of that abstract thinking of what we mean by realism.
That's fascinating, because so many of the actions itself of even Nehru were, even though the revealed preferences were realistic at many times, but there was this fear of projecting the rhetoric that they were realists, because like you mentioned, maybe it's associated with imperialism. One more reason I was thinking is maybe because of anthropomorphism in international relations as well, because we start associating things with evil, and doing something with power is evil, and that leads us to also recede this thinking in international relations, whereas the truth is that human relations are quite different from how nation states interact.
Absolutely. It's also that another aspect, I think, and it's sort of what you said about what you just said sort of brings that up, which is that we also had this whole idea about how national interest was something narrow, and therefore we had to think about global interests. And so from the beginning onwards, we were thinking about Manu Bhagwan's very fascinating book about One World and the whole idea of a global government and things of that nature. And so, and that applies to a number of policies, not just to One World, but also, of course, nuclear disarmament, but also subsequent to that, in the 1970s, to things like the new International Information Order, the new International Economic Order, the Rajiv Gandhi, plan for global disarmament and things of that nature. So there was this assumption, and to some extent Tagore's famous statements sort of also illustrate that thinking in the tradition of Indian thinking, which is that nationalism is a problem, and therefore we need to be citizens of the world. We need to worry about the global interest rather than the narrowly national interest. And so all of those sort of tie into this antipathy towards realism, because realism, of course, takes us for granted that nation states are the primary actors in international politics, and that states ultimately decide on what to do on the basis of their interests, not on the basis of other people's interests or on anything larger.
Interestingly, national interest is at least 1/7 global interest, right? Sankalp?
Yeah. Sir, how does it like to be a theorist in India, sir?
Well, I mean, it is a little bit difficult, I think, to be a theorist, especially in international politics and foreign policy areas. One reason for that is we simply do not have the density of academic scholarship to be able to engage a lot with other academics. And I'm saying that as a faculty member of the School of International Studies, which is the largest concentration of IR scholars in the country. And if you were somewhere else, if you were in Calcutta, in Jadavpur, or in Chennai, or anywhere else, or in Bangalore, you don't have the same density. But even in the School of International Studies, even though it has the largest concentration of scholars, those are large numbers of them. The vast majority of them are comparativists who focus on comparative politics, on area studies, things like that. And so not a large number of IR theorists. And so you do need to have that interaction. You need to be able to bounce ideas off of each other to sort of have an intense dialogue to be able to advance. I mean, of course, there is a global community of scholars, and one can engage with them, but it's not the same thing if you're simply writing or tweeting about people who are far, far away. I mean, it doesn't have the same effect. And I think so, therefore, especially for foreign policy, I think it is a bit difficult. But ultimately, what I do tell my students also is that, you should be a theorist only. I mean, you should do, that's true for any aspect of your career. You should do things that you enjoy. And therefore, since I enjoy doing theory, I do theory. In terms of the actual mechanics of it, it's a bit difficult, but that's the only reason I actually do theory.
How does one become realist? I mean, just to sort of push you further on that.
In some ways, I think many realists have pointed this out. It's more of your own attitude. I don't think there may be people who become self-consciously realist because they, for whatever reason, but I think most people in a sense are born realists, if I want, to put it somewhat crudely. But so you have an attitude towards life, and I think realism in foreign policy or international politics is one aspect of that. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you should obviously accept everything that you read about realism. You should be able to question realism. You should be able to question realist scholars. You disagree with them and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, it comes with an attitude, I think. And for me, even though I was kind of instinctively a realist, this is a story again that I tell my students, but the first time I read Kenneth Walsh's Theory of International Politics, it is as, it was to me a personal experience, is that it was as if the window suddenly opened and the world suddenly made sense. So, so it has to, maybe it doesn't happen like that for everybody, but you become a theorist in a particular stream or a realist or a constructivist or liberal, because those theories should help you make sense of the world. If it doesn't help you make sense of the world, then it's not really useful for you. So that also means that in one way, being a theorist is an intensely personal experience, in the sense that it is something that you should be convinced about. In the sense of both being a theorist, but also being a particular kind of theorist. Nobody can tell you that it is right or wrong. You have to be convinced that it is right or wrong. And so for me, even though I am skeptical of a lot of realist propositions, nevertheless, realism somehow makes sense to me, and it helps me make sense of the world, and so that is why, in a sense, I'm a realist.
So now let's apply this lens of realism to some of the major questions in international politics today. And you've written a paper on this on the Washington Quarterly about China's rise and how does that affect India. So let me begin with that. What, according to you, explains the worsening ties between India and China, even though there have been many attempts to rekindle the Wuhan spirit and now the Mamallapuram spirit and all those things, right?
So, Chennai Connect.
Yeah, Chennai Connect is a new one. So what explains the worsening ties from a realist lens?
A realist sort of looks essentially at the power context, at the structural context. That's where you begin. That's not where you end, but that's where you begin. And so from that perspective, it is fairly clear that China, as it rises, its power will impact on others, and others will respond to that in various ways, depending on what their capacity to respond is. So from the beginning, in fact, going back to the 50s, it was clear that China saw India as a potential problem, because Chinese leaders at that point of time, Mao and others, were intensely realist in their view of the world. And so somewhat, I think, in a way that was detriment to their own interests, but nevertheless they saw India in those lights in terms of power, in terms of how that power will impact on Chinese interests. And so that is a starting point, that you have two large powers as neighbors, and that automatically means that they would worry about each other. Doesn't automatically mean that they would fight, but that they would worry about each other. And so you find that not just vis-a-vis China and India, but all of China's neighbors. And so because China's power impacts on everybody in the neighborhood. And that is not peculiar, because obviously India's power impacts on everybody in India's neighborhood. And so that power equation is the primary reason for why there is conflict, and why that conflict will continue for the foreseeable future.
Your article was titled as "Did India Lose China?" And yesterday we were discussing when India had China.
Yeah.
So what was the overall underlying logic?
The reason I titled that "Did India Lose China?" was because there are a number of scholars and analysts in India who have argued in a way of saying that India has lost China, because they have argued that it was India's policy of getting closer to the United States that has led to the problems in Sino-Indian relations. So in that sense, that India at fault, in a sense, for the state of Sino-Indian relations. And at the time that I wrote that piece, it also seemed to be, this was immediately, of course, after Wuhan, when I wrote it. It got published much later, but that seemed to be the sense in the Indian government also, that maybe India had been too harsh, maybe India's growing closeness to the United States, to the Quad, to Japan, Australia, other countries, all of that was maybe to blame for the state of Sino-Indian relations, and therefore whether Indian policy should be changed. And so I think at Wuhan and subsequently we saw that change happening. That is the title. That's where the title came from, because there was an argument that it was India that was at fault. And so what I wanted to do was to challenge that sort of perspective.
So why did India not lose China?
So my argument is basically that two problems with that proposition that India lost China, that India getting closer to the United States, and those sorts of reasons were why Sino-Indian relations was a reason for why Sino-Indian relations are bad. I pointed to two things. One was that I demonstrated that Sino-Indian relations were bad irrespective of the state of irrespective of the state of India-US relations. That historically, going back to the 50s, China had consistently balanced against India. There may have been brief periods when they had moderated it, but the consistent trend that you see is that China had always assumed that India would be a problem and therefore had consistently balanced against it. And, plenty of examples going back to the 50s of that policy. The second aspect of it is that I argued that current Chinese aggressiveness towards India was also not the result of India's behavior, because that is the same aggressiveness that China demonstrates to all of its neighbors. So obviously it was not India being peculiar. It was not specifically being dictated by Indian behavior. So Japan and Southeast Asia, even South Korea, countries that had not only invested a lot in China, but also attempted with great effort to try to get close to China, taking China aside, even though they were allies of the United States, many of them. And despite all of those efforts, their relations with China were also poor. And so in a sense, what you're seeing is a general trend of Chinese aggressiveness, not specific to India. So both on the temporal side as well as on the in terms of the Chinese behavior in this region, I would argue that it is Chinese behavior rather than Indian behavior. That was a cause for why the state of the relations were poor, and therefore it was not India's that lost China in that respect.
Right. I remember we had this discussion over email. Based on that article, I think this illustrates the difference between realpolitik and realism, like you were saying. So one argument that is often made in India is of maintaining equal distance, or saying this, that like Kissinger had this statement with respect to Russia and China, right? That US should have better relationships with both of them than they have with each other. And that is often applied to Indian case also, saying that India should have better relationships with US and China than they have with each other. So that as a way or as a strategic choice for India. And you mentioned that is not possible. Yeah. So why do you say that?
I think there is often in Indian analysis a refusal to look at power realities. And so the United States could do that because the United States was far more powerful than either Russia or China. And India cannot do that because it is far weaker than the United States and China. And so that is not really... That makes it very, very difficult for India to do that. But the other reason why that is difficult is that India is not equidistant. This is a problem, this is a mistake that a lot of analysts, not just Indian foreign policy, but also of Asian international relations, of China and its neighbors, so on, and sort of the hedging argument becomes important in that respect. Most countries are not equidistant between the United States and China. They are all aligned with the United States. Nobody thinks of the United States as a threat. Everybody thinks of China as a threat. So yes, they may moderate their behavior. This is an argument that is made recently, a couple of years back, by Darren Lim and Jack Cooper in a piece in Security Studies, that it's not equidistant. It's very clearly everybody is balancing against China. They may be moderating that balancing for various reasons, but they are balanced. Nobody is balancing against the United States. You're not equidistant in that sense. And we are not worried about the US as a threat, obviously. We are worried about China as a threat, but we may so that equidistance part is completely wrong. So I don't think it is possible, because for us, and that is one reason why this current situation is also different from the Cold War period. So when people talk about non-alignment 2.0 or being equidistant and strategic autonomy and so on and so forth, in the Cold War, we could do that to some extent because we were truly equidistant between the two. We didn't have a dispute with either of them. We played one off against the other beautifully to get benefits from both. So we were a very large recipient of Soviet military assistance, but we were also the largest recipient of American economic assistance. And so we did both. We got economic assistance from the United States and military assistance from the Soviet Union, and diplomatic assistance at different points of time from both. We are not in the same situation today because China is our neighbor. China is not far away. And China, we have active disputes with China. We are neither a neighbor to the United States nor have active disputes with the United States. So in that sense, we cannot be equidistant from both. Countries in, let's say, in the Middle East, countries in Africa, or even countries in Latin America or Europe can do what we used to call non-alignment. But India doesn't have that choice, and most Asian states do not have that choice.
And yet you did mention in that discussion that there is little difference between US and China as great powers, right?
Absolutely.
So does it count the qualitative difference between how US and China act on or their behavior on the world stage, or as a realist it wouldn't matter?
It wouldn't matter in the sense that there are obviously tactical differences between the two sides and political cultural differences, but those do not matter very much in terms of realist analysis of state behavior towards other states. Overall, this is one reason why realists in the United States also were blamed by both conservatives within the United States in the domestic debate as well as liberals within the domestic debate, because both liberals and conservatives saw the United States as peculiarly good, as different and good, and therefore they wouldn't they refused to acknowledge that the United States and Soviet Union were the same, even though liberals may have said, have a slightly different policy options than conservatives, but they both accepted that idea that somehow the United States was different. And that is why realists were always out in the cold in that respect, because realists refused to recognize any difference between the United States and the Soviet Union. As far as realists were concerned, these were two great powers doing what great powers have done throughout history, which is fight each other because they were great powers and their interests clashed. And so in that respect, I do not think there may be tactical differences and minor differences, but in essence, there is no great difference between the United States and China as great powers. And so tomorrow, if China were to say have internal difficulties or whatever and collapse or weaken and decline, I would worry about the United States. Right? I mean, because then the United States would become a bigger threat. But in the current context, China is a bigger threat because it is more proximate to us, it is on our border, and we have disputes with it. And therefore, for us, in that context, the United States becomes a natural ally.
There is a sense of doom at times when a realist speaks, especially when you have a great power dealing with a weaker power, that weaker states must accept what they are supposed to accept. That sort of thing comes in. So how do you sort of characterize options for weaker state like India compared to China? I mean,
yeah, that is notion which is sort of the Thucydides and Melian dialogue idea. But that comes only if you are directly in a confrontation with a greater power or a superpower. But most of the times you are not most states are not in confrontation with a great power or a superpower. For most times, great powers are an opportunity for you to enhance your own interest, self-interest. So you can use them for a better opportunity to get your own interest, self-interest. But sometimes they could also be a threat, right? I mean, so it is not always that they're a danger. They can also be an opportunity. So bandwagoning is a well-known realist concept that suggests that you can join together with a great power in order to gain benefits from that great power. So it is not always the case that great powers are a problem. Sometimes they are an opportunity. But they are an opportunity, especially if you're facing another danger, a greater danger. They are not an opportunity if you are directly in conflict with them. So that is the time when you have to worry about it.
So that is where India-China relationship comes in, where there is a direct conflict.
Yeah, because there is a direct conflict between, we are both, even if we didn't have a direct conflict, the fact that they are our neighbor would want to make us worry about them. This is the whole Kautilyan notion that your greatest threat, in a sense, comes from your neighbor. And so your neighbor's neighbor is your friend because your neighbor is your problem, right? I mean, and so it is, in that sense, it is classic Kautilyan notion that, and especially when a neighbor is very powerful, then you have to worry about your neighbor. I mean, even if we didn't have a dispute, but you do have a dispute, and so that makes it even more difficult. And so in those contexts, another great power from somewhere else who you don't have a fight with, who you don't have a clash with, becomes potentially an opportunity for you to balance against your neighbor who is potentially a problem for you. And this is not, we should be familiar with this logic because this is what most of our neighbors do. And it's perfectly understandable that most of our neighbors do this because when China offers aid to Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, and if they are very eager for that aid and they're very eager to have a better political relationship with China, it is because they obviously want that aid, but it's also that they see that as potentially some way to balance against India. And that behavior should be understandable to us. I mean, it's not, it is understandable given their circumstances because for them, China, which is far away, is not a threat. India, which is close by, is a potential problem. And so that they do that to us, we do that to China. I mean, it's both of that is natural.
A last question on this. So since you mentioned neighbors, I've always come across this argument when I speak to lots of scholars and practitioners that unless India is at peace with its neighbors, India can't hope to do greater things across the world. I have somehow been uncomfortable with this because maybe the others don't want peace with you. So, but what does a realist think on this?
I mean, that I have heard this notion many times from a lot of people that I respect very much, but I agree with you. I don't think, the United States doesn't have great relations with its neighbors, but the United States is, that doesn't really hurt the United States. China, during its hegemonic periods, various Chinese empires, never had great relations with its neighbors, but, the neighbors had to basically accept that they can't do anything about China. So it is not a necessary, I don't think it is necessary, but it is possible that you don't have, you should have good relations with them as far as possible because it is in your interest in the sense that you don't want them being exploited by another external power against you because that will happen if you have bad relations. So there are pragmatic reasons for why you should have good relations, but it is not, they are not going to determine whether you are a great power or not. I mean, your great powerness will be determined only by how much wealth you generate. I mean, that's the sole criteria by which great powerness is determined. It is not on any other basis. And if you grow at 10% a year, it wouldn't really matter what your neighbors think.
Yeah. On that note of growth being essential condition for achieving great power status, probably not a sufficient but necessary condition at least. Thanks a lot, Professor. Really nice. I'm sure our listeners will enjoy this.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Look! Up in the internet! It's a meme! No! It's a cat video! No! It's the Geek Fruit Podcast!
That's right, we interrupt this riveting broadcast to tell you about our show, the Geek Fruit Podcast, where Tejas, Dinkar, and I, Jishnu, talk about everything in pop culture, including DC, Marvel, Star Wars, Netflix, and everything in between.
You know how your friends hate it when you ramble about some nerdy crap and you just want somebody to listen to you? Well, sorry, there's nothing we can do about that, but come listen to us ramble and it'll almost be like the real thing. Kind of.
Listen to new episodes of the Geek Fruit Podcast every Monday and the Geek Fruit Bulletin every Thursday on iTunes, Google Podcasts, the IVM app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Happy listening, you nerds.
Janice, what do you think couples did before TV was invented?
I don't know, go for walks on the beach, long drives, fancy dinners, have more sex maybe?
But what did we do when we decided to move in together? We debated between the Chromecast and the Fire Stick.
We gave up on sleeping early so we could stay up watching true crime shows.
We got ourselves 3 cat babies.
And basically became the cutest couch potatoes around.
Okay then.
In case you guys still haven't got it, we are a TV crazy, Netflix loving, binge watching Mr. and Mrs.
I'm Anirudh Guha.
I'm Janice Sequeira.
And if like us you snort TV for breakfast, lunch and dinner, this is the podcast for you.
Tune in every Thursday on the IVM podcast app or wherever it is that you get your podcast from. This is
Mr.
and Mrs.
Binge Watch.